part 3, the final part of Where is Buckland Brook. It's been a really, really great series of walks up until this point, and last week was really the ugly week when we were in the middle. You know, the week before at Oak Grove, it's pretty nice over there, but this week, this is the week that I really look forward to, because it's all going to come together this week, and I think you're going to leave here really knowing where Buckland Brook is, and hopefully you'll share the story with people who can get the word out. So we're going to start here. I'm going to turn it over to Don, who has done his research, and we're going to go from there.
Every time we discover something new, we've got a question. There's always a question. There's so much ground to cover here this morning. Let's talk about where we are right now. We're in the lower end of the Buckland Brook watershed. We're on the western edge of the Darlington Rehoboth Plain. We were at the stadium last week, and we're at the point of where the Buckland Brook flowed from the stadium through the industrial park, which is north of us here. And now it's making a cascade. It's starting to cascade off the plain. It's cascading down the hill here, down across Prospect and School Street, Beveridge Hill, down, down, down. And it's gonna go flow into right into Narragansett Bay. The Buckland family that settled here in the 1600s, William Buckland, was the first real permanent settlement here in the watershed. Others tried to settle. John Hazel, he failed. And Edward Smith, he was an official with the town of Rehoboth here in Rumford. His attempt to settle here failed. He ended up assimilating into the Providence settlement. John Hazel ended up assimilating into the Rehoboth settlement. Roger Williams tried to settle below us in what is Phillipsdale now. That failed. He got kicked out of there. He went over to found Providence below College Hill today. That's a whole nother piece of local history. But William Buckland got the 600 acres here in the Buckland Brook watershed and settled permanently. And his family, his heirs, continued, I believe, I may be wrong, but it's in the Buckland family history, maybe 5 generations, 5 or 6 generations. And there was a series of Joseph Bucklands. First, the second, the third, the fourth. That's why I guess they called it the Joseph Buckland Society. Go to that website. You want to find out some early history of Pawtucket, the earliest history of Rhode Island is from the European perspective. Go to the Joseph Buckland Society website. There's a lot of stuff there to read and to absorb. William Buckland had a real good setup here. He had a free-flowing, sparkling brook that was unpolluted. He was below the Pawtucket Falls, which is where down below Slater Mill today. He was at the bay level down here. His property was at the bay level. He did build a substantial and very adequate boat landing down here on the Pawtucket-Seekonk River. And we are left to assume that they had, from that point, because they built a substantial docking facility, they had the run of Narragansett Bay with a shallow draft sailing vessel. Those people were skilled in sailing, they had Narragansett Bay to themselves with a shallow draft sailing boat. The Pilgrim people explored Massachusetts Bay and traded with it to a trading post in Maine in a little sailing vessel they called a pinnace or a pinnace. I don't know quite the pronunciation. So if they could sail the Atlantic in a little sailing craft, William Buckland and his heirs could sail Narragansett Bay very easily. They say in the history, canoes. Well, yeah, maybe canoes, but I think they were a little more advanced in their mariner skills. He had the land, he had a flat lay of the land. He had forests around him. This is an eastern prairie. Where we are now is an eastern prairie. But he had forest land around. There was still the great American chestnut tree groves around here. And that wood made excellent timber for constructing dwellings. We learned last week that Sweden Swamp, the headwater of Buckland Brook, is a flowing font of artesian water activity coming to the surface, forming in part Buckland Brook. We know from our reading that Sweden Swamp, the headwater, was an Atlantic white cedar swamp, which is rare today. It's an endangered environment today, Atlantic white cedar. So the Bucklands had the timber that they needed to roof inside all their family dwellings. The Atlantic white cedar is the perfect material for shingling and clapboarding dwellings. They had it in abundance, so they really fell into and earned themselves quite a substantial piece of land. Oh, there's so much to say, but let's get back now, modern times. There's a strange concrete silo looking over across the power line, a tower. I laid eyes on that, noticed it only this week, and things clicked in my head. I have mentioned that we had a local guy that was brought up in the neighborhood back here that we meet at tea in Rumford. So he told me the stories about this neighborhood as a boy, the blue mud and blue water of the pond at the stadium. He told me the story about the trash pit over here, this side of the stadium. We walked over there last week, and he told me the story about a hill in the neighborhood when he was a kid with a big cement concrete tank. And there was a factory associated with it. And he said he didn't know what it was for, but the tank was full of water. And that according to him, prove me right, prove me wrong, the neighborhood kids would sneak to that tank and paddle in the water, swim in the water. Well, it caught up, supposedly, as the story goes, it caught up with them and a child drowned, supposedly. Now this has to be substantiated through news accounts. We've got to do some research. You've got to get your library guy on this to find the newspaper accounts.
He didn't wake up early today.
Of a possible drowning in that tank. I'm not saying it's gospel, I'm just saying this is what I'm deducting from a story. Why the water tank? It might be called a standpipe. Cities and towns call their tank reservoirs standpipes. It may be an industrial standpipe that supplied fresh water to what I'm guessing was a textile operation in the associated factory. It's the roof shape. The roof shape has facets, and usually that roof shape denotes a dyeing and finishing operation where they took bolts of cloth and colored the cloth with dyes and finished and dried the cloth for their clients. And they needed the window exposures, the light, as part of their processing, industrial processing. So this is what I've deduced from this. We've got to do some research on this. Buckland Brook came from the industrial park that we learned and saw last week, below McCoy Stadium, came through this industrial park, out the end of it, below this promontory, below this hill here. You'll see a bridge, what we call a bridge on the road coming in down below. Two bridge abutments, I guess, or bridge rails. It has a little plaque on the north side. Those structures were built by the Work Progress Administration. It was proud of President Roosevelt's answer to putting our nation to work during the Great Depression. And that was one of the projects where men were put to work by the U.S. government on public works projects during the Depression. It's got a date plaque on it that says survived, Works Progress Administration, 1940. That is toward the end of the WPA program, because what happened the next year? We got into World War II. And World War II, in essence, ended the WPA program and the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps programs, because the war put our men nationally to work as soldiers and sailors and airmen. We didn't need the WPA or the CCC anymore. We were a nation gone back to work because of war. And that was a terrible time. So that was probably one of the last local WPA projects in the area. If you go back up Buckland Brook to the Oak Grove Cemetery, there's a stone wall along the industrial highway that divides the cemetery from the industrial highway. If you look closely stop at that wall by Central Avenue, you're going to see kind of basically the same plaque denoting that wall as a WPA project as well. May have been the same men that worked on that worked on this. We don't know. But behind us is a tributary to Dunnell Pond. Dunnell Pond is in the end of it, the western end, as near as we can figure, is in this depression right over here where there's a commercial building. And Dunnell Pond was long, like a cigar shape, extended into somewhere into the area that this playing field occupies now. So this playing field has been re-landscaped and recontoured. The elevation has been lifted. The lower elevation of the pond has been left down lower and developed in a commercial complex has gone in. There was a brook feeding Dunnell Pond, as near as we can figure, came in this end and went off at an angle toward that power line. Under that power line, we just discovered this morning. And if you go out to York Avenue, what did we find this morning? Ben and myself, two separate times, a three-system drain. He explained 2 weeks ago the three-system drain on Central Avenue denoted where Buckland Brook came under Central Avenue. The three-system drain over here on York Avenue denotes where the Dunnell, what we call Dunnell Brook, came under York Avenue. If you drive York Avenue now and look for the three drains at the low point, look for the low point. Look ahead down the street. You'll see the low point. There's some factory buildings over here.
The other clue is Monticello Ave, or road, whatever it is, almost right across from the post office. There's a road that goes off called Brook Court. So Thinking that probably was named because it was near Dunnell Brook.
This side of Newport Avenue. It's all this
Yes.
side of Newport Avenue. Because if you go the other side of Newport Avenue, the landscape changes and you go into a sloping situation to the east, which is 10 Mile River watershed. So we're right at the dividing line, right over here, York Avenue, Newport Avenue.
I'm thinking that Dunnell Brook might have come from the area of St. Teresa's, maybe. Somewhere
Yeah,
over there, like where the
Yeah.
school is, not where the church is. The church sits on Newport Avenue.
yeah.
They have the school that sits in back a little bit. I don't know. That's again the speculation that I talk about. I don't know. It seems to be coming from that way.
And it's slightly south of what we called Daggett Brook, flowing the opposite direction into Slater Park. Which does this, the landscape.
Sometimes you
does
have that
this.
piggyback in the two brooks. One goes this way, one goes that way. You see that a lot.
So, you know, I've reached a point here where there's so much more that can be said, but I think now we maybe should transition back to Ben. You're going to take the folks up on the high ground. This is referred to in general terms as, it's all sand and gravel. And that sand and gravel naturally came down the way the glacier dumped it. Was covered this part, what is now parking lot, and sloped down toward the brook. So what the developers have done over the years, they've gone into this gravel bank. This is a gravel bank, and they've strip mined it, taken the gravel out, and they've probably used the sand and gravel that they've taken out to recontour this piece of landscape over here and re-landscape this, fill in the brook. The brook is channeled now. It's probably in pipes going under here. They've probably taken some of that sand and gravel around when they recontoured the Buckland Brook and recontoured with the sand and gravel back toward the industrial park to shape the landscape. And they would have used big machines to do that. So this whole footprint has been altered, except for this ridge here where the power line runs. And it's because of the power line easement that that's preserved. Otherwise that would have been dug out long ago for the sand and gravel. The sand and gravel under that power line is worth a small fortune. As a mining material, it's worth huge amounts of money. But the power line uses it for the easement to run through. So that's another thing. This whole area through the Attleboroughs, down through here, large parts of Providence, Pawtucket, Rhode Island, have been open strip mined. We don't think of it. We think of coal mining area like that. But this area has been strip mined for sand and gravel. And it doesn't happen all at once. It's happened incrementally over the years. But it's the river, the water action, it's the melting of the glacier, and it's the water action of the water running off the melting glacier that carried and formed these soils. It's the water action that carried the fine soils from the glacier that formed the Darlington, Rehoboth Plain.
But my mother remembers swimming here. And the polio scare is what filled this in. So if this was a beach until the 60s, say, this actually survived longer than Buckland Brook. So Dunnell Brook and Dunnell Pond was here even when Buckland Brook was put in its culvert. So it probably just would have flowed into a pond and it would have appeared as though it ended in a pond, but it didn't. It would have continued. But every watershed has to have a tributary. And this one has at least one. I don't know if in the upper reaches, you know, there might be some unnamed streams that flowed in, but.
Postcard that depict and show Dunnell Pond over here. And in the background on one of the postcards, you see the electric towers. in like a 1950s era, somewhere in there. You can see the electric towers in the background. But the pond, Nancy lived for a few years on Prospect Street. And when she was a girl, they'd come over here to the pond with her parents and they'd ice skate over here. And they also swam in that pond. And what happened? We got the polio outbreaks. We older people lived through polio. I mean, we have the COVID-19 now. We had the polio scares when
In the 50s.
we were kids. And you didn't want to get polio when you were a kid because you might end up in an iron lung. And they used to have all the time photos of kids in iron lungs in hospitals in Boston. And we feared being put into an iron lung. That was terrible to think about. So one of the things they thought caused the polio were beaches or exposure to beaches. And there'd be times in the summertime where they'd close swimming pools, they'd close all the beaches, and what happened, this was a swimming area, and it got the urban myth belief that this pond was the cause of polio. So what happens, the politicians use that urban myth to as an excuse to fill it in and redevelop it. So at some point the decision was made to eliminate it. Thus the piping of the brook, of what we call Dunnell Brook, the piping it's just like Buckland Brook. So they piped the whole watershed system and eliminated the swimming hole here, and that's it. You still can find old vintage postcards of the scenes of the pond here, just like the postcard scenes of Oak Grove Cemetery.
I was talking to a coworker that works at the Pawtucket location yesterday, or the other day. I don't remember what day it is anymore, but she lived in Pawtucket her whole life. She's older than me, a couple generations older. She lived in the area of McCoy Stadium, Meadow Street area by the House of Pizza, and I said, oh, we're just about wrapping up a walk in that area, and I said, our next walk is going to be down by where Dunnell Pond was, and she said, Polio Pond. So some of the older generations
it was
here
scary.
in Pawtucket still refer to this as Polio Pond. They remember.
We had a kid in my neighborhood get a light touch of polio, and we played with that kid. We played with his brother, and boy, the parents said, you stay away from there, you stay away from there, it was scary stuff. President Roosevelt was a polio victim. A lot of people don't know he was wheelchair bound, but when he was a younger man, he got polio. And they hid that from the public pretty well in photographs and stuff, that he was actually in a wheelchair because of polio.
For those of you that were here last week, these are the businesses and the mills just below where we came and turned around in the mobile home park. Right behind these trees, a little ways, is that field area. All right, so this is where we finished. East Dunnell Lane's over there, where the brook is in the culvert. Just to recap, 2 weeks ago we learned about the headwaters of Buckland Brook, so about 3.5 miles Buckland Brook comes out of Sweden Swamp, specifically Collins Pond area, which is the southern part of Sweden Swamp. Flows onto the railroad line into Pawtucket, down along Mendon Street, by the Stop and Shop, into Oak Grove, where we were, out by Walnut Hill, under Armistice Boulevard, down Delta Drive, which is where where Hasbro had their one of their factories there, and then from there it went into Hammond Pond and down through the mobile home park and then into this industrial area. Now yesterday I noticed, and you can't get in there, but this over here, look at that, that looks like wetland down there. You can see the Phragmites. I bet anything that's wet. So that's your typical Pawtucket industrial area right there. If there was a way through the fence, you could walk this ridge line and get to that field that Tim was telling us about, where they wouldn't build anything. But, Pawtucket residents, a lot of them from this area, they know the field over there where we were. And a lot of times around the 4th of July, get these big bonfires going in there. You look over and there'd be a bonfire going in the field. Anyway, something has happened to our west. The Blackstone River has reached Slater Mill. It's gone over the falls, and it becomes tidal at the bottom, and it changes its name to the Pawtucket River. Pawtucket River, which is a local name, to me, is an extension of the Blackstone River. Right around the Pawtucket Boys and Girls Club, which is west and just slightly north of us, it changes. The Pawtucket River comes and it opens. And at that point it becomes the Seekonk River, which the Seekonk River, in my mind, is an extension of the bay, whereas the Pawtucket River is an extension of the Blackstone. So in my mind, those are two separate bodies of water because of the way they open. So at this point, to our west, the Blackstone River has ended. So Buckland Brook cannot be a tributary of the Blackstone River. Buckland Brook has now become a coastal stream because we're along the coast. Seekonk River, going into the Pawtucket River, in the state of Rhode Island, that is the northernmost portion of Atlantic Ocean influence. So it is influenced by the ocean because of the tides coming in and out. So it's tidal all the way up to the falls in Pawtucket, which is a newer waterfall too, by the way. The lower Moshassuck River, as it flows into Providence through the western part of Pawtucket, that's the old flow of the Blackstone. So that's a little river and a big river's bed. Sometime the Blackstone River got cut off. Could have been by glaciers, debris, anything. Rivers are always changing course. And it made a sharp left turn. And it came through Pawtucket and dropped over those falls. So, in the grand scheme of things, those are actually newer falls. And that's why they're so dramatic there. So, they were a very important part in early Pawtucket. To our east, the 10 Mile River is getting closer and closer to the bay. It's still flowing along. As Don mentioned, there's a brook that would piggyback off of Dunnell Brook, Daggett Brook, which flowed the opposite direction and went into the 10 Mile River. And that's going to be a walk for another time too. I'd really like to show that off. So these watersheds are getting closer and closer. We're at the coast. People don't think of Pawtucket as a coastal community, but we are right at the head of the bay over here.
You got to read landscapes. If you know this was a brook, and we know the brook is over there, the brook had to come right through that industrial park, and right here. The brook came under the bridge, and on the other side of the bridge immediately went into the lower end of Dunnell Pond. Dunnell Pond went out in the direction of the ball field, and Little Dunnell Brook came in from York Avenue on the other end of the pond. So Prospect Street, in essence, is a dam or a dike to the pond, just like the roadway at Slater Park is the dam for the duck pond. When you go around the lower end of the duck pond in Slater Park, you're on the dam that holds the duck pond back. It's just the same thing. Now Ben explained the three drain system for Buckland Brook up the other end. Over by that Bob's truck body, you'll find, I believe, prove me wrong, 3 drains on the other side of the street. That's Buckland Brook crossing the street over there. And it's in the culvert underneath.
As we piece things together, this is one of the first things that jumped out at us. Because it's clearly a bridge, you know, and I don't know how many times I've driven by and not noticed that it's a bridge.
I used to live down there and never noticed it.
Yeah, so this is a bridge, and I laugh at the lack of communication here, which is very similar to now because we have a plaque here that says 1940. So they put all this work into this bridge in 1940.
Same time McCoy Stadium was being built.
Same time, under Mayor Thomas McCoy, that Buckland Brook was slated to disappear. So here they are building this beautiful stonework.
This should be restored.
Absolutely. But the Brook's fate was already sealed. I was reading a little bit about Thomas McCoy yesterday. And I got to give him credit. He acted in the best interest, what he thought was the best interest in the city for the times. We didn't have environment. We were not, we didn't think of the environment and things like that. Thomas McCoy, they called him the Prince of Pawtucket. And I can see why he is regarded as one of the better mayors of Pawtucket. And Thomas McCoy today rests in Mount St. Mary's Cemetery, just in the shadow of Buckland Brook. Buckland Brook would have crossed over Prospect, and over here, in the old days, it has to get to sea level. So it would have cascaded the rest of the way down. Later on, if you look at maps, there were dams. Always dams at a drop in the stream. But it has to get down to sea level, just like the 10 Mile River does at the Dramatic Falls at Hunts Mills. That's it, going over the fall line, getting down to sea level. Like I said, is an arm of Narragansett Bay, the northernmost water of Narragansett Bay. A couple things I want to point out really quickly. So you look straight down the bay. Well, this is the Buckland Point sewer treatment plant over here. Straight ahead, you can see the Henderson Bridge, which connects East Providence to Providence. Just to the left, where that land is jutting out, just to the left, our sister watershed where we are now, the 10 Mile River, is meeting Narragansett Bay. Right by those power plant type warehouse, behind that is where the 10 Mile River flows in. Across and to the right, there's some land jutting out closer to us, beyond where the birds are flying. That is Swan Point. So Swan Point Cemetery occupies the land across the bay here.
Off of Blackstone Boulevard.
Blackstone Boulevard in Providence. And Swan Point in itself is quite a wildlife area. A great place to walk. On that side of the Seekonk River, you have natural coastal bluffs that go up to the cemetery. That is a natural coastal feature, and it's been preserved on the Providence side of the river. Here on the Pawtucket side of the river, it's not been preserved. Surprise, surprise. But that is a coastal feature there. And it's tough to see, but all the way down, that point of land sticking out further down, you know, you're beyond Butler Hospital, and now you're over by Blackstone Park in Providence. There's the bluffs that go up there into the east side neighborhoods, and it just comes around in little coves. But as you can see, Pawtucket, Rhode Island really does have some bayside area. They don't, but it's got this chain link fence. I mean, they don't want you getting down to it and seeing it. But that's what I wanted to say about the Seekonk River here.
Oh, this had to have been in the 1600s when the Bucklands came here. This had to have been pristine, natural water, unpolluted, with everything that you could associate that would have been wild associated with Narragansett Bay. They say the Seekonk River was so rich in oyster beds. I worked on an archaeological site south on the bay down at Warwick, East Greenwich in shell middens some years ago. And the oyster shells that we were taking out of the midden pits that the Indians had consumed the shellfish and dumped the shells into pits. The oyster shells were huge. I've never seen such oyster shells so large. And what they were saying was they came out of pristine waters. They were so thick, it was unbelievable. You see an oyster shell now in the market, and they're tiny. These shells were big and thick. So the Bucklands this was their domain. They had little sailing vessels, and this was their domain. So it must have been just mind-boggling beautiful. Of course, there were Indians all along here. There were native people living all along here. And they, for a period of the 1600s, interacted with them until the hostility of the King Philip War. But during that period, historically, it's called a contact period. That period of time where the Europeans came in contact with the native people here, and they lived side by each for a little while, and then the cultures just couldn't, it didn't blend. So there was hostility, the King Philip War, and the European influence following that. The native people were treated subserviently, treated as second and third class citizens. They lived on the edges. Those that survived lived on the edges of society. They became beggars and paupers and were asked to do the menial work, like go into the cedar swamps in the winter to cut the wood. Yes, Ben.
You mentioned natives. I don't know if you mentioned, but going back to the native time, this would have been the natural boundary, right, between the Wampanoag?
This was the boundary line between the Wampanoag on the east and the Narragansett on the west. And the bay and the Blackstone River was a dividing line. And when the Europeans arrived here in the 1600s, the Narragansett were in the process of exerting their influence over the Wampanoag, because the Wampanoag population had been decimated by the European diseases. It had gotten into the Wampanoag, but it kind of left, to some extent, the Narragansett a little more healthier, so their numbers tended to stay, the population. So they became a little more powerful than the Wampanoag. And that was happening when the Europeans came in, and the Wampanoag looked to the Europeans to be allies, to help protect them, to give them strength. But it didn't last, unfortunately, because the Europeans were going to exercise power over them anyway, and that's just what happened. The diseases brought from Europe here to the native people, it was terrible. They talk about on TV with the COVID, the herd herd immunity. The native people here did not have the herd immunity to the European diseases that came here.
Take a look over here by the southernmost end of the Buckland Brook watershed. Just a little bit north of the end of the 10-mile watershed. And we're talking maybe a mile and a half apart where these twin streams meet the bay, and of course the Blackstone meeting the bay from the head of it, you know. But I find it surprising how absolutely beautiful this area right here actually is.
This
Very pretty.
This had a different influence, a different look in the 1800s and early 1900s when, again, back to steam power and steam-powered vessels. Pawtucket was a seaport. The city of Pawtucket was a seaport. Below the Blackstone Falls, below the Slater Mill, there would have been powered vessels going up and down here continuously. Ferry boats for the bay, power barges, commercial boats. There were wharfs and docking up along School Street in Pawtucket. This was a busy seaport. The cotton bales would have been coming up for the mills. I've done some reading recently, and those cotton bales coming up from the south were said to have weighed 500 pounds apiece. And just to break down them raw cotton bales up here for the mills was a full-time job for somebody to break them apart and put them through the machine processes to get all the impurities out of the cotton fiber. It was a big deal. This industrial revolution that began out of Slater Mills here up the river really was a transitional time here in American history. And we're still feeling the after effects of that period of history. But this was a busy waterway, very, very busy waterway. Look at it now, it's so quiet. We just saw the Brown University rowers were up here. Here's some out here now. Here's one. And to the right of that one, you can see the channel marker, the navigation marker, where the vessels still can go up to Pawtucket. So there's navigation markers, and they say the underground hazards here, old pilings and things, are really water hazards in here from the old docking and wharfing, especially in the Phillipsdale area, which is just down below us. Phillipsdale is that next section of East Providence below Rumford.
You know, the watershed thing. Where Don and Nancy live up in Attleboro, where our neighbors in North Attleboro live, where the people who live on Buckland Brook live, and me and Leanne over there in Pawtucket on the 10-mile, people who live in Worcester and all those areas along the Blackstone River, it all comes together right here in this cove area. All of these watersheds, excuse me, many square miles, many different people connected, all falling. All of the streams that flow into the into the Seekonk River fall into the Seekonk River.
It's a pivot point. It's a natural pivot point.
They all pour into this, and it's a lot of people and a lot of land. If we made the watershed a little bit bigger, okay, you no longer have a 10-mile watershed, you no longer have a Buckland Brook, you no longer have a Blackstone. Now this is the Seekonk watershed. Now we're talking hundreds and hundreds of square miles, going all the way up 146, drains into here. It's just a lot of people affect what happens to this waterway here.
Right after the last great glacier, the ocean shore, the ocean edge was out beyond Block Island. There was so much water taken up in the ice sheet, the world's water, so that the Blackstone River, in essence, the Taunton River, was a tributary to the Blackstone River during that time. The Taunton River flowed into the Blackstone, and what the Blackstone continued out to the ocean, which was out beyond Block Island. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to get your head around that.
Would have been a seriously major river.
Yeah, major.
Also,
major
Worcester, Massachusetts, they said, you know, had a mountain range that has eroded. But if you think about it, they're kind of the foothills, right?
That's
we're,
right.
we're in the Appalachians. And, you know, so the Blackstone River would have been a serious waterway. Not, you know, by Rhode Island standards, southern New England standards, the Blackstone River is a serious watershed. But when you compare it to some of the bigger rivers of New England, you know, the Connecticut and all of those, it really is a smaller stream. But you guys are asking the question, where is Buckland Brook? We want to answer that question for you. You guys ready for the answer? All right, why don't we go answer that question? We came here to answer a question, where is Buckland Brook? So this is the point where I'm going to answer that question for you. So, where is Buckland Brook? Well, the answer is Buckland Brook is here. Buckland Brook's been here the whole time. Begins in Sweden Swamp, South Attleboro, makes its way through Pawtucket, and outfalls into the Seekonk River. The city of Pawtucket tried really hard to erase all evidence of Buckland Brook. It's a convenient secret, it's an inconvenient truth that Buckland Brook still flows under the city, but you guys know that it does. We've seen the evidence, the bridge to nowhere. Some of us were able to see it flowing underneath that manhole cover. We see the outfall here at the Seekonk River. But the city of Pawtucket didn't cover their tracks completely, and it was a surprise to us when we first started looking. Because if you want to know where Buckland Brook is, go right around this corner and take a look, and you'll actually see Buckland Brook above ground, not in the manhole. Just watch your step, get as close as you want.
Wow, there it is.
There it is, Buckland Brook actually exists.
Wow. So that's the picture he's been posting. I said, where in the world is that? Wow.
We're gonna fix it. Here's what I want us to do as friends of the 10 Mile of Buckland Brook. I want to clear some of this out. I want to put a bench in. I want to fix the ground here. I want to have a place where people can come and see this. You know, if we say it's not pretty, but it's not ugly either, is it? You have a rocky brook. You have clear water. You have a cascading. I mean, this, you know, goes back into its culvert here to meet the Seekonk River, but I mean, it's there. It's the city left this here. Whatever the state of it is in, you know, you guys just tracked it from its source all the way down here, so I hope you feel somewhat of a connection with this at this point. I mean, maybe 100 or so yards that the city forgot about here. And I am gonna walk up along the side on the way back. The outfall the actual coming out of the tunnel will be underneath us. And as we walk on Prospect Street, it'll be back where the city wants it. But there is a Narragansett Bay combined sewer overflow just up here. What that means, all the sewage is coming down. We followed the course of this brook. There's another underground river down there that we don't want to follow. That's the sewage coming from the state of Rhode Island.
That sewage comes down the eastern side of the Blackstone River from the towns up around Lincoln, up in that area, Cumberland, Pawtucket, down to here. All that sewage is coming down to the sewage treatment plant just down below us. The same thing is happening on the Providence side. And if you've never been to a sewage plant, to see the sewage coming into a plant, it's like a freight train. And all you need is just a slight pitch in elevation from one end of the system to the other. And it does. It runs like a freight train. Same thing happens here during a storm event with the brook. They've taken all the floodplain away, top to bottom. There's no floodplain acting as a blotter to hold stormwater naturally. So when it runs off the surface during a heavy rain event, bingo, it runs off the land surface 7 to 8 square miles into street sewers, and all that water in a heartbeat is coming down out of this pipe from underground, and it's like a flash flood, and it carries all the stuff from the streets with it. There's nothing to stop it, and it ends up right out here in the bay directly. It goes through this concrete sluice. There's so much crap coming down here that we got a delta at low tide. We've got a literal delta out here in the Pawtucket River, and at low tide after a storm, you see the seagulls? You saw the seagulls out there? They'll come here by the hundreds to eat the garbage.